Okay, so we are, I want to show you something before we do skin today. Okay, so the thing that I told you about last time, I posted right here on the top of SLCC Anatomy. It's a little different than it was when I showed you because there was some more arguments that went on. So just go ahead and read through it. It's as clear as we can make it. And it has just a little breakdown of how many questions over each thing, right? Because I know you do not have infinite study time, and sometimes you need to make hard decisions, right? And then it has guidance on how spelling will count against you or for you, what is going to be required of attachments, right? What is going to be required of parenting, and what is going to be required of actions. So if the question is an action question and you get the action right but the joint wrong, you can get partial credit, but if you get the action wrong, you got the question wrong. So here's an example. And this is what we had to argue about, and we finally came to something that everybody can like be vaguely less pissed off about. So have you ever tried to come to a collaborative decision with more than 3 people? It ain't easy, right? People have opinions about crap. Okay, so the muscle biceps brachii short head, what is the correct answer for its action? Flexes the forearm at the elbow joint. Full credit, yes? What if you said flexes the forearm at the wrong joint? Then you get half credit. Okay, I don't even think you should, but I didn't win that argument. I think you should get 0 credit and learn what the damn muscle does. But they said half credit, so that's what they're going to do. If you get the action wrong, you get the whole damn thing wrong. Abbreviations, told you guys last time, touching, all that kind of stuff, bonus points, everything. So it's all there. If there is any discrepancy, it is up to your lab instructor to make the call. Okay? So, but at least they all have the same basic rubric for grading. So it's a decent start anyway. Okay. I feel like there's something I should be telling you. What is it? Anything? No? Okay. So we are going to do skin today, and we'll finish it next time. It's actually more interesting than you think. I kind of like it. So we're going to talk about the skin as a body system and then the skin as an organ. So as a body system, the skin is actually considered the integumentary system. And why is it a system? Well, because the skin is an organ. It's an organ because it has at least 2 tissues involved, right? But then you got all this other stuff like hair, nails, nerve endings, blood vessels, erector pili muscles, all that kind of stuff. Those combine to make it actually an organ system. Good? That makes sense? So let's talk about the skin as an organ real quick, and then we'll go back to the organ system thing for a second. So what do you call the organ of the skin? You either call it the skin, right? Or integument is another name for it, or the cutaneous membrane, okay? And it is the largest organ in the body. Depending on your body size, it can weigh between 6 and 9 pounds and take out about 2 square meters of surface area. And I'm not talking about subcutaneous fat. I'm just talking about the actual dermis and epidermis, right? So it's actually pretty big. Of course, it's not as big on me as it is on him, right? Because he's taller and bigger, but your skin is the largest organ in your body, 6 to 9 pounds. What do you think is the second largest organ in your body? Any idea? Liver, because it looks way the hell bigger on that cadaver than you expected, right? Literally every person is like, what? What the hell? Liver? And then usually third is your brain, about the 3rd largest in the body. And if you stretched out the skin, it covers around 2 square meters of surface area. Don't stretch out your skin, although people have, and people have made leather out of each other, and I will show you some books that were made out of humans before we get done with this. You know, humans be weird. I don't even know if you know that about people. Okay, and then your skin varies really dramatically in thickness throughout, from about 1.5 millimeters to about 4 millimeters. Where is it thinnest? Right around your eyes and around your lips. First 2 places you get wrinkles, right? Okay, and of course, where's it thickest? Yeah, the palms of your hands, soles of your feet, especially if you live in the freaking desert like in Utah, right? Anybody else move from like some moist place to Utah? Oh my God, I didn't realize that people could rip their damn sheets if they didn't exfoliate their heels. the way you can in Utah. It's like, I didn't even realize you needed to sandpaper this crap. In Texas, you're just like, oh, I just have feet. And here you're like, you have hooves. Okay. So it is composed of course, two layers. The epidermis, which is composed of what kind of tissue?
It's keratinized,
Keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And then the dermis, which is composed of a combination of two tissues. Dense irregular and areolar connective tissue. Yeah, and we'll get to the dermis soon. FYI, the fatty portion, that's not part of the skin. Okay, so the skin itself, the integument, is the dermis and the epidermis. This is hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Okay, so we always teach that with the skin, but I want you to know it's actually not part of the organ. It's deep to the organ. Good? Okay, so now the only other question I wanted to ask you about the sort of accessory organs, I don't do very much with those in lecture, is, of course, you have all of these glands associated with the skin, primarily sweat and oil, and there's multiple types of sweat and there's multiple types of oil gland. But my question to you is, are sweat glands, which is sudoriferous, and oil glands, which is sebaceous, are those endocrine or exocrine glands? Exocrine. Why? Yeah, because the product goes onto a surface, right? That makes sense? So those are exocrine glands. Okay, and so you can see in this figure as well that this right here is actually the integument, and then this is the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. Good? Okay, so before we get into the structure, I want to give a proper appreciation for the function of skin. Because if you're anything like me, you spend a lot of time worried about the appearance of your skin, but very little time thinking about the functionality of your skin. So to give you an appreciation for the functionality, let's just brainstorm the ways in which your health would be at risk if, for instance, you had third-degree burns over 60% of your body. So what ways is your health at risk? Infection, for sure. Yeah. What else? Yeah, thermoregulation. And what else? I heard enough. Moisture. Yes, moisture loss is an issue as well. So intact skin is super duper protective. It's really protective in multiple different ways. So let's look at sort of the function. So it is your body's first line of defense. And it's passively protective just by sort of closing the doors on everything, right? So it protects you from microbial invasion because most microbes can't get through the keratin layer effectively. So if you get a skin infection, is it usually in unbroken skin or in skin that was actually damaged in some other way? Yeah, damage. Now, there are exceptions. There are flesh-eating bacteria, but thank heavens they are not more common than they are, right? So there are a few that can get through there, but not very many. So unbroken skin is a good physical barrier. In addition, the secretions, both oil and sweat, are inhospitable to most bacteria, in part because they're either too salty for most bacteria, but also you actually secrete acidic secretions, which is why don't do it, it'll make you look weird. If you lick your hand, it tastes both salty and tangy. The salt is obvious, right? But the tang is acid. And the acid makes it less hospitable to bacterial invasion. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay, so, and then in addition, we will see today that your skin actually contains, even in the epidermis, where there isn't a whole hell of a lot of room for anything, there are a few immune cells called epidermal dendritic cells or Langerhans cells that sort of migrate in there. Now, there's a whole bunch more in your dermis, but in your epidermis, there's a few. So that means if something did get in there, it's not entirely unlikely that it would get caught before it actually gets any deeper. So there's a whole bunch of different ways in which it's protective. Your skin also protects you from dehydration because it's resistant to water leaving. It's also resistant to water moving in. Now, I say waterproof, but it's really just water resistant, you know, like an Apple Watch. It's not waterproof, it's water resistant, right? So you don't lose a whole hell of a lot of water accidentally via your skin. Now, sweating is different, that's purpose. And you don't take in most water-soluble stuff through your skin. Is that true with lipid-soluble stuff, though? No, lipid-soluble stuff will go straight through your skin, yeah? And sometimes you use that to your advantage. Like, for instance, lipid-soluble medications can be administered via patch, yeah? So you can do estrogen patches or testosterone patches because those things are lipid soluble. You can do nicotine patches because that's lipid soluble, right? If it were water soluble, it wouldn't really move in that way. And you'd usually have to take it orally, or you can inject it too if you needed to. Okay, your skin, although this seems silly, your skin is actually a protection from the actual living tissue getting mechanically damaged, because if you run into something with your skin, you actually run into it with dead cells, right? So if I like scrape up against something or get road rash, well, first of all, the first layer that you lose wasn't alive anyway, right? So it helps to protect the actual living tissues from mechanical damage. And then we will see today that it's tremendously protective against UV damage. We'll get to that today. Okay, and their skin does excretion and secretion, and sometimes the same fluid has excretion and secretion in it. So secretion would be something that you made on purpose, like the acid, right? And excretion would be a waste product onto the surface. And most of those go out in the water soluble, but you can have some that are lipid soluble as well. So you actually do excrete waste products onto the surface of your skin, not as much as your kidneys do, by any stretch of the imagination, but this doesn't work as well in Utah, this example, but I'm from Texas, and we drink some tequila in Texas. Anybody know what your skin smells like the day after a tequila bender? What does it smell like? It smells like tequila and regret, right? Oh, Melanie, bad decision making, bad. And that is because tequila has a lot of lipids in it. Yeah, it's kind of a fatty, oily liquor compared to other liquors. And its breakdown products get excreted onto the surface of your skin. Now, you may understand this one better if you're from Utah and of the prevailing culture in Utah. Have you ever worked in an old folks' home or been to an old folks' home? What does the old people's skin smell like besides old people? Whatever medication they are taking gets excreted onto the surface of their skin. And they end up smelling similar if they take similar medications, because a lot of the waste products go onto the surface of their skin. So we don't think about our skin as being an excretory organ, but it is an excretory organ. It has some functionality in that. And then your skin also helps with body temperature regulation, both passively and actively. So passively, just because intact skin is like closing all the doors in your house, right? So it's more likely to retain whatever temperature it was internally if you just close all the damn doors, right? But then actively, your skin also does vasoconstriction and vasodilation to the skin, and also sweating. So let's talk about how it sort of actively is engaged in the process of thermoregulation. What will happen if you're cold is that you need to keep the warm. So let's say that you have had a skiing accident, and it's going to be a little while before somebody comes to rescue you if they do at all, right? So what is going to happen is you are going to do vasoconstriction to reduce the amount of blood that goes to your skin and also to your periphery. And why? Because I need to keep the warmer blood in my core, yes? Mm-hmm. To keep these organs sort of running homeostasis. Because if I had to lose something, do I want to lose a finger or a liver? Finger. Yeah, you want to lose a finger, exactly. You got spares even. Even the tip of your nose in a pinch would be better to lose than your finger, than your liver, right? So that's simply done by vasoconstriction. So what you do is you reduce the amount of blood flow that goes to the surface. And first, of course, that just makes your skin pale. But then as it gets more extreme, it can make your skin kind of blue, especially, of course, if you have inherently lighter skin, right? It can make your skin kind of, does that make sense? Make your skin kind of blue. It's called cyanosis when your skin becomes blue. It's not always because of vasoconstriction. That can also be a heart attack or COPD. But cyanosis is just when your skin becomes kind of blue. And your lips and the beds of your nails, regardless of your skin color, will become lighter when you're in cyanotic situation and sometimes blue. So that's vasoconstriction, but vasodilation is the other way. So vasodilation is when you are warm, what you are going to do is you are going to use your skin kind of like a swamp cooler, right? So you're getting too warm in these organs. So what I'm going to do is send that warm blood to the surface of my skin. Vasodilate to send more blood to the surface, then allow the air to cool that blood, yeah? And then send that cooler blood back to the core and do it over and over again until you actually cool yourself down. In addition, when you vasodilate to the surface of your skin, it generally activates your sweat glands, which allows for evaporative cooling. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the active way that you do body temperature regulation. And then, of course, your skin, being the boundary between the internal and the external environment, is the place you should put a whole hell of a lot of sensory receptors, right? Touch, temperature, pressure, pain, they're all in your skin. That's exactly where you would want them. Okay, and then your skin also does vitamin D synthesis. When you get exposed to limited amounts of UV radiation, meaning you do not need to tan for this to occur, okay, then what you do is you activate a form of vitamin D, and vitamin D is necessary for absorption of what? Calcium. Okay, and this is an important conversation for us because a lot of us live in the Salt Lake Valley. Some of you guys live in Utah Valley, and it's not as bad down there, but it ain't good, okay? Almost every single one of us who lives in the valley is vitamin D deficient in the winter. Yes? Because of combination of short days, yes, and our pleasant inversion that occurs, okay? So, and I know this because I have a heart problem, and vitamin D levels are really, really important for people with heart problems. And so, of course, I have to get my vitamin D checked when I go to the cardiologist. And my cardiologist tells me, you and every other person in the valley probably needs to supplement vitamin D in the winter, especially if you have darker skin, for reasons I'll tell you guys in just a second. So when you're exposed to limited UV radiation, you make vitamin D. Now, of course, this is a lesson that we learned the hard way with the Industrial Revolution. You guys probably know the story, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, primarily Western Europe, when they decided that coal was fantastic and you should burn it to run all of the things. And then they ended up with a whole bunch of pollution in the air, which limited the amount of UV that was actually hitting a relatively low UV place in the begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And what started happening to the bones of their children? Yeah, it's called rickets. And they ended up with rickets, and they ended up with bowed legs, weak bones. And so, of course, they decided to fix the problem. No, they didn't. They decided to remedy the issue by starting to add vitamin D to a whole bunch of things that didn't have vitamin D in the first place, like milk. Your milk doesn't come with vitamin D. They added in there. And that started right after the Industrial Revolution. Your orange juice didn't come with vitamin D either. They added in there. And then later on, they figured out, well, maybe we should like clean up the air. But Utah still hasn't figured that part out. They're like, no, you should just definitely do something different. You should definitely not try to clean up the air. So that's vitamin D synthesis. And then your skin also acts as just kind of a place when you have 5-6 liters of blood, depending on your body size. And you don't need it all the time, everywhere, unless you're exercising. So what happens is it just kind of slowly percolates through your skin. But then if you started working out, you just shunt it from your skin to your muscles, right? So it's like a blood reservoir. It holds at any given moment around 5% of your blood. And then your skin is also temporary storage for a bunch of different stuff. Glucose, water, fats, salt, and it can store entirely different amounts depending on, for instance, how much salt you ate, right? Then you can't get your rings off the next day. Or all of the women in here know that it varies dramatically depending on the hormonal portion of your cycle, how much water and salts you actually store in there. Okay, so now what we are going to do is we are going to look at the layers of the skin or integument, and we are going to look at the epidermis, and then we're going to look at the dermis. Good? Okay. The epidermis, even the thickest epidermis is thinner than the dermis. Do you see that? Okay. It is still microscopically thin even in the soles of your feet. Okay. I guess 4 millimeters is almost microscopically thin. Still pretty thin. And so you've got the outer thinner epidermis, and you already told me what kind of tissue it was made of. It is made of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, right? With greater and lesser amounts of the keratin layer on the top, or the stratum corneum on the top. And it is made from the bottom, so the newest cells are at the bottom and the oldest cells are at the top. And we're going to talk about that as we go through today. So this bottom layer that you are seeing of the epidermis, those are the most active in cell division. And what happens is as they go through cell division, they push up, and then the newer ones that are at the bottom. So this skin up here is the oldest. These cells, they're dead now, and these are the newest. And this turnover rate is around 30 days. And most of us, you're going to get an entirely new epidermis every 30 days. So that begs the question, how is it that I have wrinkles right here if I got a new epidermis every 30 days? How is that? Because the damage occurred in the dermis. Yes. Okay. So you get a reprieve on your epidermis, but the damage you do to your dermis tends to be cumulative. Okay. And we'll see that as we go through. Okay. So it is like epithelial tissue is. This is avascular, right? It does not have any blood vessels running directly through it. And so what we are going to do is we're going to build it from the bottom to the top. And as we do, we'll learn about the 3 most common types of skin cancer, which occur here. Did you have a question? No? Okay. All right. So starting at the bottom layer, right here, this is called the stratum basale, or sometimes the stratum germinativum. Basale as in basal, as in bottom. Okay. What's directly deep to that? Before the connective tissue. What's sticking it to the connective tissue? Yeah, it's the basement membrane. So the stratum basale, all of the cells are stuck to the basement membrane, but they're also stuck to each other, right? They're trying to show that right there. How do you think they're going to be stuck to each other? What kind of lateral cell junctions would you put there? Desmosomes for strength, yeah? Desmosomes for strength. So they're going to be stuck together, kind of made as a cohort and stuck to their neighbor. So they're going to kind of move up together, right? Okay. Now, you're going to have better cell division in some of them than others, but they're still going to stay stuck to their neighbors as they move up. So that's called the stratum basale or the stratum germinativum. The cells in this layer are mostly called basal cells, yes? Or sometimes keratinocytes. They don't produce keratin yet, but that is their ultimate fate, as they're going to produce keratin. Is that okay? And I have a couple of other kinds of cells in there that I'll introduce you to in just a second. So these keratinocytes are also going to have a couple of other kinds of cells mixed in there, but let's look at the keratinocytes first. The keratinocytes are held together laterally by desmosomes, and they undergo relatively rapid cell division. They're pretty active in cell division. And as I mentioned, as the new cells are formed, the old cells move up. New cells formed, old cells move up. As they move up, we'll get this in detail a little bit. As they move up, they will eventually start to produce keratin. And then by the time they get to the top, they're really just like shingle-like bags of keratin with no organelles or anything in them. So they're dead cells, right, by the time they get up there. And they're just filled with this waterproofing protein called keratin. And that takes about 30 days from top to bottom in most of us. And you actually just exfoliate or shed them off the top when they're older. And you shed, on average, around 18 pounds of skin in your lifetime. Most of it's just hanging out in your house, pretending like it's dust. Okay? That's where most of your skin cells actually are. This is kind of interesting. When I was in college, I waited tables until I got into graduate school, and then they don't let you have a job that's like not related to your specialty in Texas. They're like, you can't have another job. So I did DNA fingerprinting. I can get DNA from anywhere that you touch because you literally leave behind your skin cells everywhere. So I could like figure out that Seth was sitting right there after he left. So because you shed skin cells everywhere. They're all on the inside of your clothes or all over your house. So if we had enough money, we would be able to catch anybody in any criminal endeavor. But we just don't have money to test that well. So what is dandruff related to this? Some people just really, really have super fast rates of cell division, keratinization, and exfoliation. And when that occurs, you're just going to sort of slough off clumps of these cells more frequently than other people. If you also have dark hair, yeah, it's going to be more visible. Good? Okay. Um, it doesn't mean anything about your hygiene at all. It's just sort of this predisposition. However, bad hygiene can exacerbate dandruff. And the reason for that is because if you don't wash regularly, you're actually not exfoliating regularly. So you're more likely to just exfoliate it at the time. So it doesn't have to do with hygiene, but poor hygiene will make dandruff far more evident. Does that make sense? So how do dandruff shampoos work? Really, all that happens with a dandruff shampoo is it's super duper exfoliating when it's wet and sudsy. And when it dries, it just sticks it to your head until the next time it gets wet. That's all it does. Ain't nothing fancy. Even the fancy prescription stuff doesn't even do anything much more fancy than that. That's all it really does. But if you have dandruff, more frequent washing is helpful. It's good for your scalp, but of course, my hairdresser best friend says it's terrible for your hair. She's like, you need to wash your hair once a week. And I was like, what am I, a caveman? Hell no. She's like, it's better for your hair. I'm like, but it smells. It's weird. Stop. I was like, I don't tell you what to do with your dumb shoes. Okay, so that's dandruff. Now we're going to meet our first kind of cancer, our first skin cancer. So I'm going to teach you the 3 major types of skin cancer. Your textbook only has late stages of each of them in the textbook, which is not helpful because if something looks like a dried up booger that won't go away, you'll probably pay attention to it. But that's not what it looks like in the early stages, which is what you really need to see. Okay, so this is basal cell carcinoma, basal because it occurs in the stratum basale. It shouldn't surprise you that in a layer that has a really high rate of cell division, it also has a slight predisposition to cancer. All epithelial tissues, right, have a predisposition to cancer, and this layer is definitely no exception. So that's what it looks like in the late stages, which is kind of obvious that something ain't right there. In the early stages, though, it looks more like this, and sometimes not even that big. It looks like a little bubble or a blister or a zit or something that doesn't heal for long periods of time, right? And even if, for instance, you popped it, it would just come right back, pop it, come right back. Does that make sense? If there is a good thing about any cancer, the good thing about this cancer is it's really, really slow to metastasize. Do you know the word metastasize? It's when it stops respecting the boundaries and starts to move into other tissues and it becomes, malignant and really damaging. So this one is super duper slow to metastasize. If you excise it surgically, you get a complete cure around 99% of the time. But if you have one, you have a predisposition to it. And now you know you've got a predisposition to basal cell carcinoma. All of these cancers are not inherited, but they have a genetic predisposition. So for instance, my husband actually has a basal cell carcinoma right now. He's only 45. But what does that tell me about my kids? My kids have a predisposition, so it's even more important for them to protect their skin, right? Because I have this information now. So let's talk about the locations that people usually get skin cancer, okay? So where do most people get most of their skin cancers? Actually, let's separate it by sex because it's actually different by sex. And it doesn't have anything to do with your hormones. Where do men get most of their skin cancers? They get it primarily on their face, the back of their neck, the back of their ears, hands. Yeah? Okay. And actually primarily on one side of their face in this country. The left side of their face. Yes, because we are drivers on this side. I'll show you some pictures about what the sun does based on a truck driver that will blow your damn mind and make you tint your windows, okay? So on the left side of their face. Why are women slightly less likely to get cancers on their face than men?
Because they take care of their faces?
Yeah, because we're vain as hell, starting at like age 11, right? Okay, and it's not like I started wearing sunscreen because I was worried about cancer. It's because I was worried about ugly. That's why, right? I'm not even gonna lie to you guys. I've seen ugly happen to everybody. Cancer doesn't happen to everybody. So makeup, right? And most of the makeup itself is protective, and most of us actually now wear makeup with sunscreen in it. And even when we're not wearing makeup, most of us actually, how many of the women in here, let's just take a poll, wear something with sunscreen in it on their face? Yeah? Okay, So that's the vast majority of us that wear something with sunscreen in it on their face. How many of the men in here put something with sunscreen in it on their face? 2, right? And that's pretty good, actually, because generally it's 0, okay? So men are more likely to get it in those locations. Also, in the back of their necks is more common for men because, of course, women typically have longer hair, right? At least at some point in their life have longer hair. Where do women get most of their skin cancers? Yes, this is the location that every single one of us who is over 30 wishes we had paid attention to. Yes? Because I knew ugly could happen here, but I didn't realize that this was going to tell everybody my age, right? And this, right? Hands and here. So this is where we get most of our skin cancers. And back here. Especially, it's culturally different. We don't wear as short stuff here in Utah as they do, for instance, in Florida. But on our legs, and we don't tend to look back there very much after like age 14 because nobody likes it. You're like, I assume it's fine. I don't even want to see it. Let's just assume, right? So we get cancers that actually are more likely to go a little longer on the backs of our legs because we don't really check back there. We're like, oh, I still have legs. It's okay. So that's all 3 forms of skin cancer. That's where we are more likely to get them. But there is no guarantee that you will not get a skin cancer in a place that has never been exposed to the sun. I have a friend who got melanoma, which we'll talk about in just a minute, on her labia minora because she had shit luck, not because she tanned that way. That did not happen, right? That is, I know, right? That would be some serious effort. So it can happen just anywhere. It's just that UV radiation increases the likelihood for reasons we'll see in just a second. So that's basal cell carcinoma. And that's the first of our cancers that we will meet. So let's meet the other 2 kinds of cells that are present in the basal layer. And then we'll meet another kind of cancer as well. So also present in the basal layer is these guys right here. These are called tactile cells or Merkel cells, and they are the most superficial sensory receptors that you have. Notice that they're attached to a nerve ending. You don't have any sensory receptors above that at all, and most of your sensory receptors are actually in the dermis, okay? That's why you could, I don't know if normal people do this, but I know redneck children without enough toys do it, because I is one. Stick pins in your fingers and go chase your siblings around, right? Why can you do that? Why doesn't it bleed? Why doesn't it hurt? Avascular, yes. No nerve endings until you hit the deepest layer. And you know it when you hit that layer, right? Then it ceases to be torturing your siblings and it becomes torturing yourself, right? So you don't have any sensory ending at all until you get right here. And that's called a tactile or Merkel cell. And then also present in this layer is these little guys right here called melanocytes. And melanocytes, do you see what they look like? To me, they look kind of like Oogie Boogie. Do you guys know what Oogie Boogie is? Mm-hmm. Oogie Boogie from Nightmare Before Christmas? If you don't, you need to watch Nightmare Before Christmas. So that looks kind of like Oogie Boogie, okay? So let's talk about melanocytes and their function. Melanocytes are really interesting. We're going to slow down and take a little time looking at them. What melanocytes do is they make this pigment. It's a protein called melanin, okay? Melan means dark. Melanie means dark. Okay. It also means earth goddess, just in case you were wondering. Okay. Keep that in mind. So what these do is they make this protein pigment right here, and they put it in vacuoles, and it's brown, yellow, brown, or black. There's like 3 different common forms of melanin: brown, yellow, brown, or black. They're all dark pigmented though. And what it does is it makes melanin, but it doesn't keep all of it. It actually allows some of it to go into the tissue around it. And this dark pigment works the same as putting a dark shirt on in the sun, right? So if you put a dark shirt on, then the sun bounces, the UV radiation bounces off the dark shirt, and it actually doesn't get into the skin. This is what this does for your skin. UV just bounces off, right? And it's tremendously protective. And it's really, really important to protect yourselves against UV radiation because UV radiation is a known mutagen, meaning it mutates your DNA. causes minor damages in copying of your DNA. That's really, really important because if you mutate your DNA, you can mutate one of the portions of your DNA involved in controlling cell division. And then you increase your likelihood of cancer. So UV radiation is a known mutagen, which makes it a known carcinogen. Yes? So what you need to do is you need to protect the nuclei of that and other cells as much as possible from UV radiation. It works so well at being a mutagen and a carcinogen that when we were working in the lab, I did molecular biology for research. If I wanted to make, for instance, E. coli get a new characteristic that it didn't have before, I just blast it with UV radiation until it mutates into a new form of E. coli. So it's a really, really good mutagen. So with that in mind, what this is actually doing is it's protecting the nuclei of your cells. And so now let's bring that back to the skin cancer story. With the skin cancer story, you all know it, but now I want you to understand why. Who is more predisposed to skin cancer? People with inherently dark skin or people with inherently light skin? Light skin, by far. Yes? Does that mean that anyone with dark skin has never gotten skin cancer? No, because cancer's a dick and it just does whatever the hell it wants, right? Right? But it means that if you're looking at the stats, right, she is a prime candidate for sunscreen and protection to make sure that she is protecting herself from UV radiation and the likelihood of mutation. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to talk now about inherent skin color, tanning, and sunburning, and then we'll talk about melanoma. So melanin is a brown, yellow, brown, or black protein. You inherit which flavor of melanin. It's genetically inherited. There's some different forms of it. And it's responsible in part for the color of your skin, but also your hair and also your eyes, okay? And it's more complicated than that, but let's just go ahead and say that melanin is responsible for skin, hair, and eyes. Let's talk about hair for just a minute. Assuming that some of us in here have not dyed our hair, which I totally have. I don't even know what the hell color it is anymore. I vaguely remember it being a color when I was a kid, but let's assume that this was my natural hair color. That would mean that I had more melanin production in my hair follicles. And if that is your natural hair color, I have no idea, and nobody cares anymore, then she would have less melanin production. Yes? Okay. What about eyes? Eyes are kind of complicated, so I'm going to tell you a short version. It's kind of truthy. It's not exactly true. It's more complicated than this. There's a whole bunch of different genes that are involved in eye color, but all of us have 2 layers of color potentially on our eyes. The back layer usually shows up as kind of gray-blue. All babies are born with that just there, right? Okay. The front layer has different degrees of melanin in it. And my melanin tends to have, my melanin will layer over that, and I can get hazel eyes or green eyes or different shades of blue, right? So all of us have blue eyes on the back, and then we've got some degree of something on the front. Your blue isn't necessarily the same color on the back, though. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's eye color a little bit. And then skin color. Skin color is really a combination of the degree of melanin that you have and the persistence of melanin. So all of us have relatively the same number of melanocytes, but some of us have more active melanocytes and more persistent melanin. Okay? By persistent, what I mean is the melanin that you make here, it stays around for a lot longer when it's produced. Also, it goes more superficial in some people, okay? And that's sort of genetically determined. But then there are 2 other pigments that help to determine the skin tone, because we know that people are not black and people are not white. There's every variation of skin tone. And this is just a small smattering of them. This is some variations of skin tone. But you could also probably represent a whole bunch of tones in between each one of those. So skin is not just black versus white. There are tonal variations, and the tonal variations have to do with the other 2 pigments as well. The other 2 pigments are carotene, and carotene is kind of a yellowish pigment, sometimes greenish. Those of us who have olive skin, classic olive skin. I've got olive skin, she's got olive skin. And olive skin can be really dark versus light, but the undertone of your skin has a little yellow or green to it. And I would be willing to bet that you also experience that when you are sick, you look green as hell. It's like nobody has to ask you if you're sick if you got olive skin. They're gonna be like, what the hell is going on there? So that's got to do with the amount of keratin that you have. And then others of us have real capillaries that are really close to the surface. And so hemoglobin, right, is going to make your skin look kind of pinkish. Yes? And so it's the combination of those three, the amounts, the forms that you have of those three that gives you your skin color, right? And primarily that's genetically inherited. I'm not talking about tanning yet. We'll talk about tanning in just a second. Just talking about your inherent skin color. Go ahead.
So I was blonde when I was little,
Mm-hmm.
and as I got older and the more kids I had, my hair got darker. My hair's a little bit lighter than what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
Mine's fake too.
Yes.
So does that mean that you produce more?
Pregnancy jacks everything up.
But even before I started having kids, my hair.
Yeah, most of us have lighter hair when we're younger and it gets darker as we get older. Your melanin production sort of ramps up from childhood. So I bet some of you blonde people were like little toe heads, like almost white, right? When you were babies. My hair was red when I was a kid, so it had far less melanin than it has now. So it changes, it sort of ramps up. Your eyes are the first thing to sort of get stable as far as their color. And then your skin is usually lighter when you're younger as well, even without UV exposure. And then your hair is kind of the last one to sort of settle into the amount of melanin that it has. So I want to talk about skin color variation and sort of the evolution behind it because it's kind of interesting. Okay, so when we look at skin color variation, if we could imagine that everyone is staying with their indigenous population, historical indigenous population, then skin color kind of looks like this. The predisposition to skin color kind of looks like this, which is kind of an interesting story because there are a couple of questions you can ask here. First off, everything genetic and everything historical and everything archaeological that we have ever found confirms that human life started where? Africa, yes, started in Africa. So in all likelihood, all of our ancestors had relatively dark skin. And I want you to understand that light skin is a mutation. Yes? Dark skin is the default. Light skin is a mutation. But there obviously was something that favored it as you move away from the equator. So let's talk about the equator first for just a second. And talk about, anybody have a hypothesis as to why dark skin was favored evolutionarily near the equator? Yeah, so this is a NASA map of UV exposure. Can you see where UV exposure is most intense? Yes? Okay. And so NASA map of UV exposure sort of overlaid with skin color will tell you that you need more protection from UV exposure closer to the equator. But then, of course, as you move away from the equator, you don't have that selective pressure, but you have another one. Anybody know what the other one is? What is the other selective pressure? As you move toward the poles, why do skin colors tend to sort of stabilize in the lighter region? Why? What would you say? It's vitamin D. Yes, it's vitamin D. So as you move away and you're not getting as much UV radiation, you need for the UV radiation to actually penetrate more effectively. So what happens is, historically speaking, over 200,000–300,000 years of human evolution, you were more likely to survive and reproduce around the equator if you had more UV protection. But as you moved away from the equator, you were more likely to survive and reproduce if you had lighter skin and therefore more of the ability to make vitamin D. Does that make sense? Okay. So you see these sort of selective pressures change. Of course, we're all mutts now, right? We're really mobile populations in most places, but this is historically what has been true. And it's kind of an interesting story. Okay, so, all right, so skin color variation, all the same relative number of melanocytes. Differences are primarily due to melanocyte activity and how long melanin persists. But then there's those two other proteins. Those don't seem to have any particular selective advantage one way or the other. right? It doesn't seem to matter how much keratin you have. It's just like population, like you either got it or didn't, right? And it doesn't seem to matter whether the hemoglobin is closer or further away from your skin. No particular selective advantage to either one. Okay, so now let's talk about some disorders and clinical applications of melanin production. So I know you guys have all heard of albinism before. Albinism, yeah? They used to call people with albinism albinos, but they don't like being called albinos, so you just say a person with albinism, right? Because then it's got at least person in it, right? So let's look at what albinism actually is. So this is a person of some kind of Caucasian descent. And what albinism is you've got a genetic mutation that precludes you making melanin. So there's a biochemical pathway that results in the production of melanin. There's a whole bunch of different enzymes in it. If you damage an enzyme at the very beginning of the process, you are likely to have albinism of the skin, the hair, and the eyes. If you damage it later, you might have 1, 2 of them. Does that make sense? Okay. So this child has albinism of the skin, the hair, and the eyes. Really no appreciable level of melanin. What do you think about this child's predisposition to skin cancer if exposed to UV radiation? It's through the roof, right? Okay. Now, anybody want to tell me why people with albinism of the eyes end up with eyes that look red or pink? What are you actually seeing? You're seeing the capillaries in their eyes. And what they have is they have lost the pigment in both of those layers, and so all you're really seeing is the capillaries that are going through their eyes. That's why they look red. Now, people with albinism of the eyes who don't have any color protection also have really high risk of eye cancer and also eye damage when exposed to UV radiation. They lose their eyesight progressively. Okay? Now, this matters because some of you in here have very light eyes. You don't have albinism, but how many of you guys have blue eyes? Yeah? Okay, you guys need to buy good sunglasses and wear them because those of us who have dark eyes have less likelihood of UV damage than those of you who have lighter eyes. Go ahead.
What I've noticed for most of my life, I had green eyes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, very pigmented. And then about 15 years ago, they started becoming blue, and now they're extremely sensitive.
Ooh, interesting. Something changed with your melanin production. I wonder if mine will change. That's interesting. And now they're really sensitive to light?
Very sensitive and blue.
Interesting. Most time eye color doesn't change that much in adulthood. Okay, so this child has albinism of skin, the hair, and the eyes. This child is probably of African descent, and he's got albinism of the hair and albinism of the skin, but he doesn't have complete albinism of his eyes. Do you see that he still has some pigmentation in his eyes? Okay. Now, with anyone with albinism at all, they need to protect from the sun. They have just damn near no protection at all. And most forms of albinism are autosomal dominant disorders, genetic disorders, and you guys have probably learned about them before. And so they tend to pop up in isolated populations. Why is that? Inbreeding, exactly. If you have an island population, right, then you are far more likely to make a baby with your first cousin than if you are not on an island population, right? Just out of necessity, right? And so historically speaking, albinism has been one of those disorders that pops up with inbreeding. And it pops up with inbreeding not just in isolation, Appalachia, kind of isolated, but also with royal families. That's sort of self-imposed isolation. Why do they do that in royal families, historically speaking?
Keep the bloodline.
Yeah, because if you are royalty and this person is royalty, even if they're your first cousin, that's a good marriage because it keeps the power and it keeps the money all isolated. Even if you are Cleopatra and you decide to, for instance, marry your little brother, which is what she did, married a little brother. Okay, so that's albinism. And then vitiligo, have you guys heard of vitiligo? Okay, vitiligo is not genetic, it's an autoimmune disorder. And vitiligo, what it does is your immune system makes a mistake and it starts to destroy melanocytes, okay? And it can go into remission and then they'll come back and then it'll come back. So it destroys melanocytes and you have this patchy loss of pigmentation wherever your melanocytes are destroyed. And you can see that the person in the bottom probably is of African descent. The person in the top probably is of some other descent. I don't know. So you can see that vitiligo is more noticeable when people have darker skin. It's no more likely to occur in people with darker skin. Here's a little girl with vitiligo. This is what Michael Jackson said bleached his skin.
Right.
And we can put an asterisk on that because that may have been how it started, but that's not how it ended, right? Because vitiligo does not bleach it nice and evenly like that. You can actually get bleaching products that will actually do it from there, which is probably what actually occurred with him. So this is vitiligo as well. Now, wherever you've lost pigmentation, you are at very, very high risk of cancer. So you have to protect your skin, okay? And then this is this beautiful model who has vitiligo. Her name is Winnie Harlow. And her vitiligo is interesting because it's so symmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that? Yeah, so that's vitiligo as well. Okay, and then let's talk about suntans for just a second. So what the hell is going on with the suntan? What is going on with the suntan is that you are making your melanocytes cry. Okay, so when you expose your skin to UV radiation, your melanocytes go, I really need to keep up, and they try their damnedest to keep up with melanin production, to make sure that the UV actually doesn't damage the deeper layers. And so what they're doing is they're working their hardest to keep up. And what they're going to have, you're going to have an acute increase in the amount of melanin in areas that were exposed to UV radiation. Okay? Does that mean that tans are actually healthy? No, they're actually an attempt to protect you from damage. But UV, some of it may actually be getting in there anyway, even if you don't burn. So skin that is tanned repeatedly, even without burning, in all likelihood you are breaking down some collagen and elastic fibers underneath. So if you want to see the difference between skin that has like tan versus not tan, if you're one of those people who's ever been a tanner, I want you to look at, for instance, your hands versus your booty and see which skin has more elasticity. Unless you tan naked and have an A control. I don't know what else to tell you, right? It is making your melanocytes acutely increase their production. But what about a sunburn? With a sunburn, because you actually don't have any blood vessels in the epidermis, and a sunburn demonstrates first and foremost initially as redness and irritation, you have confirmation that you have gotten UV radiation into your dermis, which means that it also hit all of those mitotic cells on the way down. Yes? And sunburns are a much bigger deal than I thought they were when I was a kid. I was like baby oil and iodine on my roof kind of kid. No sunscreen whatsoever. Didn't even think about it. But now we know that sunburns are especially a big deal with children because their cells are undergoing cell division all the time. And the stats are against you if you damage a cell that has decades of cell division ahead of it, damage the DNA in that one. Do you see why it would be statistically against you? Now, the last time I read it, which was last semester, I didn't look up the data this semester, but they say that 2 blistering sunburns during childhood increases your lifetime risk of all 3 types of skin cancer up to 250%. So it's super duper important to protect your kids' skin. They got a lot of cell division ahead of them. It's just that you are making stats against you. You damage DNA that has just decades and decades of cell division ahead of it. That's the issue. It's less of an issue as an adult because you don't have as many decades ahead of you. So that's what a sunburn is. And the other deal with the sunburn is that when you damage the collagen and elastic fibers, because it actually got down there, as you age, they don't replenish very well. So what you see in skin that has had a lot of sun is it's got less elasticity, yeah, than skin that has not had a lot of sun. Less elasticity and less spring back. Okay, so, yeah, go ahead.
How does sunburn work with darker skin?
Sunburn work with darker skin? You can. It's unlikely that people with darker skin will get sunburns as quickly as people with lighter skin. But what happens is, even though there's a whole bunch of melanin in there, enough UV radiation can still damage the dermis. That's what happens. It's just harder to get it, right? Because you're bouncing most of it off. So, but with enough UV radiation, especially the UV radiation that penetrates a little bit deeper. I think it's UVB that penetrates a little deeper. UVB penetrates a little deeper. It will irritate your dermis, and you can still get blistering, and you can still get damage and irritation, right? It just takes longer to get it. That's all. First, you will get a lot of melanin production, right? So even with darker skin and UV radiation, you are going to get darker still, right, before you actually get damage. Go ahead.
I've always been curious about why people get sunburned,
Uh-huh.
because I've never had one before.
Yeah.
So, I've heard people always say why people get sunburned. And me, I'm like, in a way, I feel like, yes, we do, because I feel like during summertime, my skin tends to get a bit more darker.
Oh, you're getting a tan, but it's going to be really difficult with inherently dark skin to stay in the sun long enough to actually damage your dermis. But I want you to think about what would happen if you were, for instance, stranded on a desert island without a tree to sit under. Do you not think that your dermis would eventually get pissed off? Yeah, it would eventually get pissed off, right? You would get to as dark as possible, and then your dermis would actually get irritated, and then you get swelling and irritation. And you could eventually even get blistering. It's just that there's so much inherent protection in people with darker skin that it's really difficult to get there unless you're have no other way to protect yourself. So it's really unlikely, but it's not zero likelihood, right? Not zero.
UVA penetrates deep.
Oh, UVA penetrates deeper. I couldn't remember which one. Okay, so pigmented moles. So people kind of misunderstand what the hell's going on with moles and what relationship they have with cancer. I've had this mole since I was a little kid. This mole helped me learn my right from my left. It's always been there. And my dermatologist always looks at it. But what is a pigmented mole? It's just an area where developmentally I actually have an accumulation of melanocytes in one area. It just blobbed there, right? So that's a mole. Now, what are freckles? Freckles are different than moles. Freckles are a genetic predisposition, and if you have somebody with freckles, it's actually autosomal dominant, and it just means that collectively their melanocytes are more likely to be clustered, okay? This one's just one cluster. This is just developmental. Clustered everywhere would be genetic. Okay, so pigmented moles. Why are people worried about moles when it comes to cancer? Because if I have a boatload of melanocytes right there, then statistically, this is the place I might want to concentrate on for melanoma. Just because there's more there, right? So that's why my doctor looks at this every time and makes sure that it hasn't changed from the last time, right? So now we're going to talk about the really, really serious type of skin cancer. This one is called melanoma, and it is uncontrolled mitosis of the melanocytes. So it only accounts for 5% of skin cancers, but it accounts for the vast majority of skin cancer deaths because it metastasizes super duper quickly, right? It starts and then it goes brain, it goes lungs, it goes bones, it goes all over the place, right? So melanoma has a really low survival rate. I'm not saying you won't survive melanoma. I'm saying compared to the other two, it has a really low survival rate. And so again, your textbook only showed melanoma like this, right? And everybody knows that that does not look good, right? But melanoma actually starts out not actually even having much depth to it. It's not dipped. It's not risen. It's just sort of this dark spot, right? And if the dark spot has always been there, you're not going to pay that much attention to it. But then melanoma actually starts having some certain characteristics. So these are all melanomas as well. Okay, and what we will see is that, first of all, if you think you have melanoma, get yourself to the doctor. Do not ask anybody else to diagnose you. Go to the doctor, okay, because it's serious. But second, in order to sort of understand melanoma, they use the ABCDE thing. Okay, you should get that checked out for damn sure, right? Okay. Most melanomas will be asymmetrical, that's the A. Most melanomas will have an irregular border, right, a jagged border. Most melanomas will have variability in color within, good. Most melanomas are actually relatively large in diameter, 6 millimeters or more, not all of them. And then they will evolve. If you watch them over time, they will start to look different. So except for the evolving, which you can't tell from a still picture, let's look at A, B, C, and D on these. These are all melanomas, all diagnosed. Asymmetry, yes? Yeah? Irregular borders. Yeah, definitely irregular borders. Color variation within. Yeah, even this one only has a little bit, but it has color variation within.
Well, and there's
And then,
actually pigmentation.
oh, that's true. Yeah, that pigmentation out there, you're right. And then the diameter. You don't have anything for scale here, but as they get bigger, they are far more serious and far more likely. So, my little personal story about melanoma from a friend of mine, it's not from me, is this sort of really brought home how serious melanoma was. When I got my first faculty job in Texas, I just got out of graduate school. I was 27, and one of the women that I worked with was like in her 50s, so she survived. But when she was 25, she was going to school up in New York, and then would come home to Texas, school up in New York, come home to Texas. And her mom noticed this little spot close to her left clavicle. And she said, you need to get that checked. And then we did what we do when our mom tells us something to do when we're 25, which is wah, 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 and go back to New York, right? And so that happened a couple times, and her mom said, okay, I think it's different this time. You really need to go get checked. The third time she came home, her mom picked her up from the airport and took her straight to the dermatologist and already made an appointment without her permission, because that's what you do sometimes. And she didn't actually ever leave the dermatology office that day. She got admitted to the hospital. They diagnosed it. It was a melanoma, and they took it so seriously. It was not even as big as the tip of my finger, the tip of my little finger. And then they took lymph node biopsies from here and here, and they figured out that in all likelihood it had already metastasized. They didn't know if it had gone past. And this is how much tissue they took. They took tissue from her chin all the way out to the edge of her shoulder, down to her xiphoid process, so a big old kite shaped. And then they did skin grafts. And then she had radiation and chemotherapy, and they gave her 2 years to live. She survived. She's one of those success stories, but it was that serious. So melanoma is super duper aggressive. It has a very, very strong genetic component. So if you know that anyone in your family has had melanoma, then you need to pay really, really close attention to your skin, right? So if you have someone who is a willing participant, and preferably really engaged participant, you can do mole checks at home, and maybe it'll turn into something more fun, right? But make sure that it's consensual mole checks, right? Right? Consensual mole checks with a high five and a hell yes. That's what you want. Okay, so that's melanoma. And now the last thing we'll talk about today is we'll do the stratum spinosum and then get our last cancer, and then I'll let you guys go because you're a little ahead of the other class. So stratum spinosum is the next layer up. Let's talk about it. Okay, next layer up is right here. Do you see in this layer, so it's everything between this layer that's stuck to the basement membrane and when you start getting the pigmented cells up here, yeah? And so it's variable in thickness, yeah? But do you see how some of the cells get kind of pointy? That's why it's called the stratum spinosum, as in spiny or prickly. Sometimes they call these prickle cells, okay? And so cell division slows here, but it's still going. Good. And before we talk about the cancer and the other things that go on here, this is where you have your first immune cells, your most superficial immune cells. So these are called epidermal dendritic cells, or sometimes Langerhans cells. And these cells will whoop up on anything that gets in here. That make sense? So those are immune system cells. Okay, so mitosis is still occurring there, but it slows down. And then the last of our skin cancers, there are more skin cancers than this, but the last of the three major ones occurs here. And it is called squamous cell carcinoma. And squamous cell carcinoma, because eventually the cells will be squamous. I don't know why the hell they didn't call it something else, but it's called squamous cell carcinoma. If these cells lose control of their cell division, then you get another type of cancer. As far as likelihood of metastasis, melanoma is most likely. Basal cell is least likely, and this one is in between. You do tend to have a little grace period before it metastasizes, but if you let it metastasize, it's really hard to get control of it. So this one, in the early stages, well, again, they only represent it in the late stages when it looks terrible, okay? In the early stages, it looks kind of like somebody pulled a scab off too soon and it just never heals. So it's kind of scaly and irritated, and it stays like that for a really long period of time, and no matter how much Neosporin you put on it, how much you moisturize it, it just doesn't heal, Okay, and then in the later stages, it tends to be dome-like and red, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so this one, it does metastasize, but not very quickly. This is the one, have you ever seen this on like the hands or skulls of elderly old men? Yeah? You do see these, right? You see them on their hands and you see them on their skulls, and they may not be like, they don't look like they're bleeding, but it looks like really irritated, okay? So these you see, especially as men get bald, you can see them on their heads. So that is squamous cell carcinoma, and that's sort of intermediate in severity of the three. Okay, and we will stop there for today because you guys are a little ahead of the other class.